It is 22nd June, 1943. Off the Dutch coast, between The Hague and Den Helder, a German convoy pushes south through grey North Sea waters. There are merchant ships, low and heavy laden, wallowing in the swell, and surrounding them, bristling with anti-aircraft guns, are the convoy's guardians, the Voorpostenbooten, the flak ships, the armed trawlers and minesweepers that the Kriegsmarine has stationed along the route. The Germans have learned their lesson. Torpedo bombers cannot press home and attack through a wall of fire. The escorts make that approach suicidal. For months, this logic has held. The convoy system works because the escorts work. Kill the escorts and you break the convoy open. But nobody, so far, has found a reliable way to do it. At 14,000 feet above the horizon to the west, the crew of a Bristol Beaufighter notice nothing unusual about the scene below. 2 minutes, then 1. Then the formation is down to wave-top height, engines screaming at 1,735 horsepower each, wings shuddering at nearly 320 kilometers per hour. The pilot lines up not on the merchant ships, not on the cargo. He lines up on the flak ships, on the escorts themselves. He squeezes the firing button and 8 rockets leap from beneath the wings, 8 steel-bodied projectiles, each carrying a 60-pound semi-armor-piercing warhead, each moving at 260 meters per second. The first salvo strikes the nearest Voorpostenboot along the waterline. A second Beaufighter hits another. The guns fall silent. The escort is no longer a threat, and in the seconds that follow, the torpedo-carrying aircraft behind them, the Torbos, have a clear run at the merchant ships beyond. This was the strike wing, and this was the moment the RAF's Coastal Command stopped playing defense. The story of how Britain developed a weapon system designed specifically to destroy German convoy escorts, not the convoys themselves, but their protectors, is one of the least celebrated tactical innovations of the entire war at sea. It did not sink battleships. It did not feature in newsreel footage. It was not the province of decorated aces or famous aircraft names, but in the grinding, attrition-heavy campaign to cut off German industry from the vital supplies of iron ore that kept its war machine running. The Coastal Command Strike Wing and its rocket-armed Beaufighters achieved something remarkable. They turned the escort ship from an impenetrable shield into a liability. To understand why this mattered, you have to understand what German coastal convoy traffic meant to the Reich in the middle years of the war. Sweden was neutral, but Swedish iron ore, pulled from the mines around Kiruna and Gällivare, was absolutely critical to German steel production. Estimates suggest that roughly a third of Germany's annual iron ore requirement came from Sweden during the war years, and that ore moved by ship. Down through the Skagerrak, along the Norwegian coast, across the North Sea to German ports. On the other side of the equation, Norway's own industries were being systematically exploited, and that output too moved by sea. The route hugged the coastline for a reason: the shallow waters, the proximity to shore, the possibility of air cover from Luftwaffe bases in occupied Norway. A coastal convoy was, in theory, a protected convoy. The problem for Britain was reaching these convoys at all. Long-range patrol aircraft could find them, but attacking them was another matter entirely. Before 1942, the RAF's standard anti-shipping weapon was the torpedo, and torpedo attack against a defended convoy was an extraordinary act of courage bordering on suicide. The torpedo aircraft had to fly straight and level for a considerable distance to line up the shot, perhaps at no more than 30 meters altitude, perhaps for 15 agonizing seconds of straight and level flight directly toward the target. In those 15 seconds, every gun on every escort ship was pointed at the attacker. Loss rates were staggering. In some early operations, they exceeded 30% per sortie. Experienced crews were lost faster than new ones could be trained. The torpedo remained essential, but without a way to suppress the escorts first, the men delivering it were flying into near certain death. By late 1941 and into 1942, Coastal Command was trying various partial solutions. Fighter-bomber variants of the Beaufighter carrying bombs could attack escort ships, but bombing accuracy at low level against maneuvering ships was poor. Cannon fire from multiple aircraft could drive down the heads of gun crews momentarily, but it lacked the punch to actually destroy flak ships. What was needed was a weapon with the reach and accuracy of a cannon, the destructive power of a bomb, and the weight of armor-piercing punch to actually penetrate and sink a small warship. Nothing in the RAF's armory quite matched that description. Not yet. The solution began not with naval planners, but with anti-aircraft engineers. In the late 1930s, the British were quietly developing a family of rocket projectiles, designated unrotated projectiles, or UPs to disguise their true nature, initially as a means of laying aerial minefields to defend against low-flying bombers. By 1941, the 3-inch rocket had reached a level of maturity that made it worth investigating for other purposes. The projectile development establishment at Fort Halstead in Kent, overseen by the director of ballistics research, Alwyn Crowe, had spent years solving the fundamental challenges: how to ignite a rocket electrically while an aircraft was in motion, how to stabilize a fin-guided projectile without spinning it, and how to design a fuse that would not arm prematurely during the launch sequence. The result was the RP-3, rocket projectile, 3-inch, a weapon that used its nominal diameter as its name. The body of the rocket was a steel tube 76 millimeters in diameter, roughly the thickness of a thick length of domestic drain pipe. Packed inside was 5 kilograms of cordite SC, an electrically ignited solventless propellant that burned fast and clean. Atop this was the warhead, initially a 25-pound solid armor-piercing head, later replaced by the definitive 60-pound semi-armor-piercing high-explosive variant that became standard in the maritime role. The complete round weighed 27 kilograms for the warhead alone, 64 kilograms in total. At 260 meters per second, it hit with the kinetic energy of an artillery shell but could be fired from an aircraft moving at 300 kilometers per hour, without recoil, without the barrel erosion problems of a cannon, and with a reach far beyond any machine gun. A typical Beaufighter TF Mark X installation carried 8 RP-3 rockets, 4 under each wing on fixed launching rails. A selector switch allowed the pilot to fire them in pairs or as a full salvo of 8, though in practice the preferred approach was to release a full salvo in a single pass. At the low altitudes at which Coastal Command operated, often at just 15 to 30 meters above the surface, accuracy depended entirely on the pilot's skill in estimating range and deflection. Sighting was through the standard GM2 reflector gun sight, later modified to allow the line of sight to be depressed, using a graduated scale to account for the rocket's trajectory drop. The learning curve was steep, but the crews who mastered it found that a well-aimed salvo of 8 60-pound rockets, striking a flak ship along its waterline or across its bridge structure, was comprehensively lethal. The breakthrough tactical insight came at RAF North Coates, a coastal command station on the Lincolnshire coast. By late 1942, 3 Beaufighter squadrons had been concentrated there to form the North Coates Strike Wing, numbers 143, 236, and 254 squadrons. The original concept allocated 1 squadron to fighter top cover, 1 to bomb attack on escort ships, and the 3rd to torpedo attack on merchant vessels. Results were disappointing. The bombers lacked accuracy. The fighters couldn't simultaneously protect the formation and suppress ground fire. In November 1942, on only the wing's 2nd operation, the squadrons became separated in poor weather, attacked independently, and suffered severe losses to flak and Focke-Wulf FW-190s without commensurate results. The wing was stood down for intensive training and doctrinal revision. What emerged from that reappraisal, put into practice from the spring of 1943 onwards, was elegant in its simplicity. The torpedo aircraft, the torpedoes, would remain the primary strike weapon against merchant ships, but they would be preceded by a dedicated wave of rocket-armed Beaufighters whose sole purpose was the destruction of the escort vessels, not to suppress them temporarily, not to drive their crews below decks, to sink them, or at minimum to silence them so decisively that the torpedo carriers behind could make their runs unmolested. These rocket-carrying aircraft were known with characteristic RAF pragmatism as flak bows, Beaufighters whose job was to kill the flak. The escort ship, previously the convoy's greatest protection, had become the strike wing's first target. The first operational use of the RP-3 by Coastal Command in the maritime anti-escort role came on 22nd June 1943, when the North Coast Strike Wing attacked that convoy off the Dutch coast. The crews were still learning. Post-war research would temper some of the more ambitious claims made at the time about damage inflicted. 2 Beaufighters were shot down, but the principle had been tested and the tactics would be refined rapidly with each subsequent operation. By mid-1943, the strike wing concept had proven itself enough that a second wing was formed. Numbers 144 and 404 squadrons RACAF, operating from RAF Wick in northern Scotland. In the 10 months following the adoption of the rocket-led escort suppression tactic at North Coasts, records indicate that approximately 29,762 tons of enemy shipping was sent to the bottom. And that figure represents the North Coasts Wing alone. The wider Strike Wing campaign, encompassing multiple wings operating from Scotland, East Anglia, and later Cornwall, would account for over 150,000 tons of shipping and 117 vessels before the end of the war. What the raw tonnage figures do not capture is the psychological dimension. Survivors of strike wing attacks described an experience unlike anything the Kriegsmarine had faced before. The Beaufighters came in at near wave-top height, almost too low for flak guns depressed to their maximum elevation to track. They came fast, faster than the human eye could comfortably follow at close range. And they came in numbers, a dozen or more aircraft simultaneously attacking from different angles, their rockets trailing smoke as they crossed the few hundred meters of open water between the aircraft and the ship. A single direct hit from a 60-pound warhead on the bridge structure of a flak ship was frequently enough to kill or wound the entire gun crew. 2 or 3 hits below the waterline could open the hull fatally within minutes. The Norwegian resistance, working in conjunction with the cracking of the Enigma cipher at Bletchley Park, provided strike wing planners with advance intelligence of convoy movements along the Norwegian coast with remarkable frequency. Aircrew later recalled that they rarely arrived off the Norwegian coast without seeing a target. The combination of ultra-intelligence and determined resistance reporting turned the Norwegian coastal waters into a hunting ground. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It keeps this kind of deep dive history coming. Notable operations accumulated quickly. On August 14, 1944, number 404, Squadron RCAF participated in a strike that sank the destroyer Z-24 and dealt fatal damage to T-24 in the Gironde estuary off the French Atlantic coast. Off Norway, strike wings repeatedly targeted the spare Brescia, specially reinforced flak ships whose very purpose was to absorb rocket and cannon fire on behalf of more valuable vessels, and found that even these armored targets could be overwhelmed by a coordinated multi-aircraft salvo. Germany was not unaware of the threat, and the Kriegsmarine's response illustrates just how seriously the strike wings were taken. From mid-1943 onwards, coastal convoy traffic along the Norwegian coast was increasingly restricted to hours of darkness, placing considerable logistical strain on the supply system and reducing throughput substantially. Convoys that had previously run freely in daylight hours were forced into a twilight schedule, limiting the hours in which they could safely transit from port to port. Additional flak ships, more heavily armed, more numerous, were added to convoy escorts, but this proved a perverse solution since it simply gave the rocket-armed Beaufighters more high-value targets at which to aim. The Luftwaffe attempted to provide fighter cover for convoys, and encounters with Focke-Wulf FW-190s of Jägerschwader 5 from Norwegian bases were frequent and costly. The catastrophe, known as Black Friday, 9 February 1945, when 7 Beaufighters of the Dalachi wing were shot down by FW-190s during an attack on the destroyer Z-33 in Førde Fjord, demonstrated that the strike wings operated at constant risk, even at war's end, and that the Admiralty's insistence on prioritizing escort warships over merchant vessels could occasionally place aircrew in positions of unnecessary danger. The losses sustained that day led directly to revised orders, placing merchant ships back at the top of the target priority list. American practice in the Pacific Theater developed a broadly similar concept: the use of the Mark 27 Cutie acoustic torpedo, adapted from the airborne Fido homing weapon, to target convoy escort vessels from submarines. But this was a passive acoustic system guided by propeller noise rather than a direct attack weapon, and it arrived late in the war and was used in relatively small numbers. The Germans had their own acoustic torpedo, the T-5 Zaunkönig. The British codenamed it the Gina-T. But this was a U-boat weapon designed to destroy Allied convoy escorts, a direct inversion of the problem the strike wings were solving. There was no German equivalent of the coordinated rocket-led anti-escort strike formation. The Luftwaffe's anti-shipping capability, formidable in 1940 and 1941, had been substantially depleted by the time the strike wings reached their peak effectiveness in 1944. The legacy of the strike wing tactic extends well beyond the tonnage figures. In the space of roughly 18 months, from the summer of 1943 to the end of the war, the North Coast Strike Wing alone accounted for shipping losses that represented half the total sunk by all British strike wings combined. Over 120 Beaufighters were lost, and 241 aircrew were killed or are still listed as missing. The men who flew these missions, at wave-top height, in close formation, toward ships that were firing everything they had, did so in the knowledge that survival of a direct flak hit at low altitude over open water was measured in seconds. What they achieved was a fundamental shift in the calculus of coastal convoy defense. Before the strike wing, an escort-heavy convoy was close to impregnable from the air. After it, the escorts were the first things to die. The German response, at night sailing, more escorts, fighter cover, strengthened spare pressure, indicates clearly that they recognized the threat and had no clean answer to it. By late 1944, Norwegian coastal shipping had been pushed almost entirely to hours of darkness, its operational tempo drastically reduced. The Swedish iron ore that had flowed so reliably south to German steelworks was arriving in smaller quantities, less predictably, at greater cost. The rocket-armed Beaufighter had not won the Battle of the Atlantic alone, but it had strangled one of the key arteries that kept Germany fighting. Examples of the Bristol Beaufighter can be seen today at the Royal Air Force Museum at Cosford in Shropshire and at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, where number, sir, 455. Squadron RAAF's contribution to the Strike Wing campaign is remembered. The RP-3 rocket, meanwhile, remained in RAF service long after the war. Its last confirmed major operational use was during the Aden emergency in 1964, more than 20 years after its debut over the North Sea. Return for a moment to that convoy off the Dutch coast. June 1943. The flagships are burning, the escorts are silent. Where before there was a wall of fire between the torpedo aircraft and their targets, there is now open water and a clear run-in. The torbows behind the flakbows are already lining up their shots. That image captures something essential about the British genius for tactical adaptation. The problem was not lack of courage. Britain had demonstrated, repeatedly and at terrible cost, that there was no shortage of men willing to press home a torpedo attack through concentrated anti-aircraft fire. The problem was tactical. The problem was systemic. The escort ship was a weapon, and like any weapon, it had a counter. The answer was not to fly faster, or to attack at night, or to somehow absorb the fire and survive it. The answer was to kill the weapon before it could be used. The RP-3 rocket gave Coastal Command the means to do exactly that. Not a sophisticated guided weapon, not an acoustic seeker or a radar proximity fuse. A steel tube filled with cordite, capped with a 60-pound semi-armor-piercing warhead, fired from a twin-engine heavy fighter at wave-top height. Simple in concept, lethal in execution. The strike wing sank escorts because killing the escorts was the mission. Not an accident, not a side effect, the whole point. The torpedo was the killing stroke. The rocket was what made the killing stroke possible. And together, flown by men from Britain, Australia, New Zealand and Canada, against one of the most heavily defended coastal shipping routes in the world, they demonstrated something that military planners in every subsequent conflict have had cause to remember. The most dangerous thing in any convoy is not the cargo. It is the ship that stands between you and it. Kill the Guardian first. Everything else follows. If you liked my video, please share your opinion in the comments box and subscribe to the channel. Also, turn on the bell icon so that the latest videos like this keep reaching you. See you in the next video. Take care and goodbye.